Trump had always believed that his power came from the ability to control narratives and bend people to his will. For decades, his method was simple: intimidate, overwhelm, and outmaneuver anyone who dared to stand in his way. So when Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's voice began cutting through the noise with sharp precision, it irritated him more than most. She wasn't just another critic shouting from the sidelines. She was a sitting member of Congress who wasn't afraid to name him directly and call out his tactics for what they were. Every time she appeared on television or social media, her words carried a sting, and every time she pointed out his hypocrisy, he felt it dig into his image like a blade. Trump had always relied on the power of legal intimidation. Lawsuits, cease and desist letters, vague threats of investigations, these had been his tools for years. He saw the courts not as instruments of justice, but as weapons to silence or exhaust his opponents. So, in his mind, going after Jasmine Crockett was just another play in a game he believed he had mastered. He leaned on his allies, urging them to dig into her background, to twist her words, to find anything that could be spun into a reason for her to face jail time. To him, the appearance of power was just as important as the reality of it. If he could make her look vulnerable, he thought, it would silence her and scare others who might try to follow her lead. But the flaw in Trump's thinking was that Jasmine Crockett wasn't like his previous opponents. She didn't shrink at the first sign of pressure, and she wasn't afraid of his reputation for aggressive retaliation. When whispers emerged that Trump was looking for ways to push her into legal trouble, she didn't back down. Instead, she went on the offensive, exposing his very tactic for what it was: a desperate attempt by a man drowning in his own legal problems to weaponize the system against those who dared to challenge him. By naming him directly, she turned his own strategy inside out. What he had intended as a show of force was suddenly being reframed as evidence of weakness. The public reaction was swift. Instead of questioning Crockett, people began questioning Trump's behavior. Why was a former president so focused on silencing a sitting congresswoman? Why was he willing to use the idea of jail, a punishment already hanging over his own head, as a threat against her? Every step he took to tighten the screws only made him look more unhinged. He had underestimated not just Crockett's resolve, but the way people would see through the move. For Trump, control had always been about spectacle. He thrived on the idea that when he pointed, others scrambled. But this time, the spectacle turned against him. Clips of Crockett dismantling his actions spread across news broadcasts and social platforms, her sharp delivery slicing through the noise. She framed the story clearly. A man facing his own indictments was trying to weaponize jail against a critic, and it exposed everything people needed to know about his character. The more she spoke, the more support she gained, and the weaker his threats looked. In private, Trump fumed. He had expected her to be rattled, to retreat into silence, or at least to soften her criticism under pressure. Instead, she was using his very attempt to crush her as a platform to make her voice louder. What he saw as an easy win had quickly spiraled into a political miscalculation. Allies who had once nodded along began to question whether this was the right battle to pick. Some even distanced themselves, worried that the optics of a powerful man trying to gel a black congresswoman would backfire beyond repair. The more he pushed, the more isolated he became. And yet, Trump could not stop himself. His entire career had been built on the belief that doubling down was the only way forward. But each attempt only hardened Crockett's position. She became the embodiment of resistance to his bullying, the example others pointed to when asked how to respond to him. His overreach, what he thought would silence her, instead set in motion a chain of events that magnified her voice and diminished his own. Trump's effort to weaponize the justice system against Jasmine Crockett revealed a truth he had long ignored: the old methods that had worked for him in boardrooms, on television sets, and in political rallies were no longer as effective when faced with opponents unwilling to play his game. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't the one dictating the terms of the fight. Instead, he was caught in a trap of his own making, and the spotlight he had tried to turn on her was now shining brightly back on him. When Trump's attempt to rattle Jasmine Crockett became public, many expected her to retreat under the weight of his name and influence. That had been his pattern for years: threaten someone, make them second-guess themselves, and force them to waste energy defending against accusations instead of staying on the attack. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, she saw the situation as proof of everything she had been saying about him. To her, Trump's attempt to drag her into legal jeopardy was not just an attack on her personally, but a demonstration of how he operated when challenged. And rather than ducking away from the fight, she walked straight into it with unshakable confidence. Crockett's strategy was simple, but devastating. She refused to play defense. She didn't waste time explaining herself or pleading innocence because she knew that was exactly what Trump wanted. He thrived when his opponents were on their heels, scrambling to clear their names while he framed the narrative. Instead, she flipped the script and went directly at him. In press conferences, interviews, and committee hearings, She framed his threats not as a sign of her wrongdoing, but as a sign of his desperation. She reminded the public that this was a man already facing multiple indictments, a man who had built his brand on twisting the legal system for personal gain. And now he was trying to turn those same tactics on her. Her words hit hard because they rang true. People had already seen Trump use lawsuits and investigations as weapons throughout his career. Now, Crockett was exposing the pattern in real time. She called it out for what it was, an abuse of power, a sign of fear, and an effort to silence. A black woman who refused to bow to him. Every time she spoke, she reframed the story away from his accusations and onto his motives. Instead of the headlines reading about Trump's claims, they began to highlight his hypocrisy. Trump, for his part, grew increasingly frustrated. He had always believed that his name alone was enough to intimidate, but Crockett made it clear. She was unmoved. She refused to treat him as larger than life. Instead, she reduced him to a desperate man flailing under the weight of his own troubles. She would say things like, "This isn't about me. This is about him trying to distract from his indictments," and those words cut deep. By pointing the spotlight back at his legal problems, she ensured that every time he tried to attack her, people were reminded of the very issues he was trying to bury. Her refusal to play his game also inspired others. Colleagues who had once been cautious about crossing Trump began to echo her words. They saw in her approach a roadmap for handling his intimidation. Don't retreat. Don't get lost in defending yourself. Expose his tactics for what they are. It was a shift in tone that left Trump scrambling. His usual ability to dominate the conversation was slipping away, and he didn't know how to regain control. The public's response was equally telling. Instead of Crockett's credibility being questioned, her courage was celebrated. She became a symbol of resistance against bullying. Someone who showed that standing firm could unravel the illusion of Trump's power. Clips of her calmly dismantling his attempts went viral, shared not only by her supporters, but even by those who had once been skeptical of her. The contrast between Trump's bluster and her sharp, grounded counterattack was stark. He looked increasingly erratic, while she looked measured and unafraid. Trump had always depended on fear of his wealth, fear of his influence, fear of his followers, but Crockett made it clear she wasn't afraid. And in politics, once fear is stripped away, power loses much of its force. By refusing to cower, she exposed the limits of his influence in a way few had managed before. What he saw as a show of dominance instead revealed his vulnerability. Even as Trump tried to escalate, Crockett continued to stand firm. She didn't match his insults with insults. Instead, she matched his threats with facts. She highlighted his record, his pending trials, his repeated attempts to use the legal system as a personal tool. The more she spoke, the more people saw the cracks in his image. Rather than looking like a strong man, he looked like a man running scared. And for Trump, who had always thrived on projecting invincibility, there was no greater humiliation. Crockett's counterattack worked because it wasn't about trading blows. It was about exposing the foundation of Trump's power and showing it was hollow. She understood that the only way to defeat a bully is not to play their game, but to reveal it. And that's exactly what she did, leaving Trump facing a reality he hadn't expected. His threats no longer carried the weight they once did, and the more he aimed them at her, the smaller he seemed. When the story broke that Trump had tried to use legal pressure to silence Jasmine Crockett, the backlash came faster than he or his team could have imagined. What he thought would be a private show of force sending signals through his allies and whispering about investigations quickly turned into a public spectacle. Instead of Crockett scrambling to defend herself, the headlines turned on him. News outlets began questioning why a man already under multiple indictments would be so fixated on a congresswoman whose only crime was refusing to back down from him. The optics were terrible, and the reaction from the public made them even worse. People saw the situation for what it was. A powerful figure trying to bully a sitting member of Congress into silence. For many, it felt like a pattern they had seen before. Trump had long been accused of using lawsuits and threats to shut people up. But this time, the target wasn't a former employee or a rival businessman. It was a lawmaker with a national platform and the ability to speak back without fear. That difference changed everything. Instead of sympathy leaning toward Trump, it swung heavily toward Crockett. Communities across the country began rallying behind her. Supporters saw in her a reflection of something larger, the refusal to let someone with power dictate the terms of debate. They admired the way she didn't just respond, but turned the pressure back on him. Social media filled with clips of her dismantling his attempts, and each clip gained traction not just among her base, but among ordinary people who were tired of Trump's bullying. Hashtags supporting her began trending, and the very narrative Trump had hoped to control slipped completely out of his hands. Even within political circles, the backlash was noticeable. Members of Congress who might have otherwise remained neutral began speaking up, not because they were aligned with Crockett on every issue, but because Trump's move was viewed as crossing a dangerous line. Weaponizing the idea of jail against an elected official set off alarms. It wasn't just seen as an attack on her, it was an attack on the system itself. His attempt to silence her inadvertently sparked a broader conversation about abuse of power, misuse of influence, and the risks of normalizing intimidation in politics. The irony was that Trump had sought to make an example of Crockett, hoping others would think twice before challenging him so directly. Instead, the backlash created the opposite effect. She became an example of how standing firm could actually turn the tide. Others saw her resilience and recognized that the public was ready to rally behind those who refused to bow. The intimidation factor that Trump had wielded for so long suddenly looked less effective. For Trump personally, the backlash stung. He had built his political brand on projecting strength and dominance, and yet here was a congresswoman exposing his weakness in front of the entire country. The fact that the public wasn't rallying behind him, but instead mocking his efforts made it worse. His opponents painted the picture of a man so desperate to hide his own failures that he was willing to threaten jail for someone who simply criticized him. The ridicule hit him harder than the criticism. Trump had always been able to spin backlash as unfair attacks from the media or the establishment, but this time, the story wasn't being driven by his opponents alone, it was being carried by the public's response. Crockett didn't need to overplay her hand to keep the spotlight where it belonged. She simply let the facts speak. Trump was trying to silence her, and she wasn't backing down. That truth resonated deeply, particularly with those who had felt silenced themselves in other contexts. Her ability to turn his attack into a collective rallying point made the backlash larger than either of them individually. Even some of Trump's allies recognized the danger in his approach. Behind closed doors, they whispered concerns that going after Crockett was a mistake. It gave her a platform, fueled public outrage, and only deepened the narrative of Trump as someone who abused power when cornered. But Trump wasn't the type to admit regret, and by the time he realized how badly the public had turned on him, the damage was already done. The backlash became the defining feature of the episode. What he had hoped would be a quiet display of dominance ended up as a loud reminder of his growing inability to control the story. And every time Crockett spoke, every time she reminded people of his hypocrisy, the backlash deepened. Trump's move not only failed, it backfired in a way that made his attempt look less like strength and more like weakness exposed under the brightest light. Trump had set the plan in motion, believing it would end with Jasmine Crockett weakened, isolated, and silenced. In his mind, using legal threats and the weight of his influence to corner her was a tried-and-true method. For years, it had worked against critics, employees, and rivals who couldn't withstand the financial and emotional toll of a fight with him. But what he didn't anticipate was how this attempt would spiral completely out of his control, turning into one of those moments where the very tools he relied on ended up working against him. Instead of crippling Crockett, the situation amplified her voice and handed her a national stage that she might never have had otherwise. The first unintended consequence came almost immediately. Crockett's refusal to retreat and her sharp dismantling of his actions went viral across platforms. Every clip of her standing firm, every soundbite where she pointed out his hypocrisy, spread faster than anything he had prepared. People who had never followed her career before suddenly knew her name. She wasn't just another lawmaker speaking in the noise of Washington. She was the woman who stood up to Trump and refused to blink. What was supposed to bury her instead launched her to new visibility. As her profile grew, so did her credibility. Journalists who had once given only passing coverage to her remarks now sought her out for interviews. Her voice began appearing in op-eds, nightly news segments, and online debates. She framed Trump's attempt against her not as a personal fight, but as an example of the danger of allowing someone to manipulate systems of power for personal grudges. That framing resonated far beyond her immediate supporters. It made her look not just like a politician defending herself, but like a leader speaking for anyone who had ever been targeted unfairly by someone with more power. Trump watched this unfold with frustration. He had wanted to silence her, but instead, he had made her stronger. His mistake was in underestimating how quickly the public could turn against someone who looked like they were abusing power. The narrative shifted almost overnight. It wasn't Crockett on trial, it was Trump's behavior. Commentators across the spectrum questioned why he would even focus on her when he himself was entangled in so many legal battles. The contrast was glaring. He was a former president fighting multiple indictments, and yet he was trying to push a congresswoman into jail simply for challenging him. That irony became the story, and it stuck. The second unintended consequence was political. By going after Crockett, Trump inadvertently unified people who didn't always see eye to eye. Some lawmakers who had previously avoided taking strong stances against him found it easier to rally behind Crockett, not because they agreed with all her politics, but because the idea of Trump targeting her was too blatant to ignore. He had crossed a line, and that gave others the freedom to call him out without hesitation. In a strange way, Crockett became a bridge between groups who otherwise might not have come together. Trump's overreach created common ground, and it made him look even more reckless in comparison. The third unintended consequence was the way it revealed cracks in his own circle. Allies who had once cheered his aggressive tactics started quietly questioning whether this was worth the cost. Going after a congresswoman and losing that battle didn't project the dominance they had come to expect from him, it projected weakness. Some whispered that his instincts were no longer as sharp, that the old intimidation tricks weren't landing the way they used to, and for Trump, who had always thrived on being seen as invincible, that perception was dangerous. Meanwhile, Crockett embraced the attention without overreaching. She didn't need to stretch the truth or dramatize the situation. She simply laid out what happened, reminded the public of his ongoing legal woes, and kept the focus on his hypocrisy. The more straightforward she was, the more credible she became. She framed the episode as less about herself and more about the principle. If Trump could try this with her, what did it mean for everyone else who dared to challenge him? That question stuck in people's minds, and it turned her into a symbol of defiance far larger than she had been before. For Trump, the regret was unavoidable. He had wanted to make her regret speaking out, but instead, he ended up strengthening her platform and weakening his own. Every attempt to escalate only made the story worse for him, because it reinforced the very narrative she was pushing, that he was desperate, vindictive, and willing to abuse power when cornered. By trying to control the story, he lost it entirely, and what remained was the image of Jasmine Crockett standing taller than ever, with a louder voice, while he was left dealing with the unintended consequences of his own miscalculation. The clash between Trump and Jasmine Crockett revealed something far larger than a simple political feud. It was a test of how power is used, and more importantly, how it can backfire when misapplied. Trump entered the situation believing his name, his history, and his force of personality would be enough to silence a rising critic. For years, that strategy had worked. He leaned on intimidation, legal maneuvers, and the sheer spectacle of his presence to overwhelm opponents. But in targeting Crockett, he underestimated the strength of someone who wasn't intimidated by his tactics and who had the skill to turn his aggression into her own advantage. Crockett's response showed the power of standing firm in the face of manufactured pressure. She didn't fall into the trap of playing defense or getting bogged down in refuting baseless claims. Instead, she focused on exposing the very nature of Trump's Movan attempt to weaponize the system and distract from his own legal problems. That approach allowed her to flip the script, shifting the public's attention away from herself and directly onto him. Rather than appearing vulnerable, she emerged as unshakable. Rather than being silenced, her voice grew louder. For Trump, the attempt became a study in unintended consequences. What began as an effort to dominate the narrative ended with him fueling a wave of backlash. He inadvertently gave Crockett a national platform and highlighted his own vulnerabilities in the process. Every time he tried to push harder, it only reinforced her point that he relied on bullying tactics to mask weakness. By targeting her, he made her stronger, and by trying to control the story, he lost it entirely. The episode also carried broader meaning. It sent a message to others who had long been wary of crossing Trump that his intimidation could be challenged. Crockett demonstrated that refusing to bend did not mean certain defeat. In fact, it could create momentum that turned the tables. Completely, her ability to withstand this pressure became an example others could point to, reshaping the perception of what it meant to stand up to him. In the end, Trump was left grappling with a reality he didn't expect. The old strategies that had once protected him no longer guaranteed success. The spectacle of his threats no longer carried the same weight, and the public was quicker to recognize and reject abuse of power when they saw it. Crockett had not only defended herself, but had turned his own tactics against him, leaving him with regret instead of victory. This story was more than just a personal standoff between two figures. It revealed the changing dynamics of political power, where intimidation could be dismantled by resilience, and where attempts to silence could instead amplify. In trying to make an example of Jasmine Crockett, Trump ended up creating one, but not in the way he intended. She became proof that strength isn't in how loudly someone threatens, but in how firmly someone stands when threatened. And in that, she left him facing the one thing he had spent his career avoiding, the real